Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The U.S. moves forward a $1 billion weapons package for Israel. So the Biden administration has notified Congress that it intends to move forward with a weapons package for Israel worth over $1 billion as Israeli tanks are pushing further into Rafah. So this arms package was first reported by the Wall Street Journal, and it includes $700 million in tank ammunition, $500 million in tactical vehicles, and $60 million in mortar rounds. The arms could take years to deliver. This is kind of the first step in the process. But this deal, really demonstrates the U.S.'s long-term commitment to arming Israel, despite President Biden's warning that he could stop supplying certain types of weapons if Israel launches a major attack on population centers in Rafah. It also shows Israel that any tank munitions it uses in Rafah will be replenished. Reuters reported on Tuesday that Israeli tanks had entered residential districts in eastern Rafah. So they continue to escalate in Rafah. So while the U.S. has said that it's put a hold on one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said on Monday that the U.S. was still committed to Israel and would make sure that it received all of the $17 billion in new military aid that was recently approved by Congress. He said, quote, "We are continuing to send military assistance, and we will ensure that Israel receives the full amount provided in the supplemental. We have paused a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs because we do not believe they should be dropped in densely populated cities. We are talking to the Israeli government about this," end quote. So I noticed something today, that all of the comments from U.S. officials about the paused bomb shipment, they just mentioned the 2,000-pound bombs. And there were initial reports, and I think some U.S. officials said it, that they put a pause on a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs and a shipment of 500-pound bombs. So I actually asked the State Department if they could clarify if there was a hold on both of the bombs. And they got back to me, but all they did was point to the statement from Sullivan that I just read. So that tells me that there is no hold on 500-pound bombs. So the question is, did they pause it initially and then decide to go ahead with the shipment? Hopefully we could figure that out. But it was, I just noticed that. And, it goes to show one shipment of 2,000-pound bombs is really nothing when it comes to how much military aid the U.S. has provided Israel over the past 7 months, and now how much it's going to continue to provide with that new $17 billion. And Sullivan also made clear that Israel's push into Rafah still has not crossed Biden's red line, if one exists at all. Sullivan said, quote, "We still believe it would be a mistake to launch a major military operation into the heart of Rafah that would put huge numbers of civilians at risk without a clear strategic gain. The president was clear he would not supply certain offensive weapons for such an operation were it to occur, and it has not yet occurred," end quote. So even though right now, as of Tuesday, the UN says about 450 Palestinians have been driven out of Rafah. And the estimates before Israel launched the operation to capture the border crossing and started pushing into the city, it was estimated there was about 1.4 million Palestinian civilians sheltering in the city. So now almost a third have been forced out, and they have nowhere safe to go. It's not clear where they're all going. And the aid deliveries are still cut off to southern Israel, adding to this starvation blockade. But no, that's not enough for Biden to really take any action. This really goes to show how much of a PR move that was, those comments that he made. All right, so the next story here is pretty similar. U.S. ambassador says that the U.S. and Israel don't have real disagreements. So the U.S. ambassador to Israel has downplayed President Biden's warning about Rafah, saying that nothing has fundamentally changed in the U.S.-Israel relationship and that the two countries don't have real disagreements. And I mentioned the background about what Biden said recently. So Ambassador Jack Lew told Israel's Channel 12 on Sunday that so far the U.S. has approved Israel's operations in Rafah, which continue to escalate. He said, quote, "So before there is a decision on how to proceed, the president was clear in the interview he gave the other evening that what Israel's done so far hasn't crossed over into the area where our disagreements lie. I'm hoping we don't end up with real disagreements," end quote. So he also downplayed the hold on the shipment of 2,000-pound bombs. He said, quote, "Just to be clear, we're providing an enormous amount of aid. We have been since before October 7th. It's increased since October 7th, and even this week as everyone's focusing on the decision to just delay one set of munitions, everything else keeps flowing. I think it's a mistake to think that anything has fundamentally changed in the relationship," end quote. So there you have it. We've seen a lot of U.S. officials say similar things, but he's saying there's no real disagreements. All right. The next one here, Gaza ceasefire deadlocked as Rafah attack sets talks backward. So this article's from Al Jazeera. Israel's military operation in Gaza's southern city of Rafah has set ceasefire negotiations with Hamas backward, mediator Qatar has said, adding that the talks have lost steam. So this is Qatar's Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed bin Abdul Rahman bin Jassim Al Thani. He has a very long name. He said, quote, "Especially in the past few weeks, we have seen some momentum building, but unfortunately, things didn't move in the right direction, and right now we are on a status of almost a stalemate. And of course, what happened with Rafah has set us backward," end quote. So negotiators were recently in Egypt, but they all, the Hamas and Israeli negotiators, but they left. And there's no sign really that there's any chance here. And then this story just goes to mention all the other Israeli escalations in Gaza that certainly are not going to help the situation. All right, so the next one here, Israeli ministers march for settlements in Gaza. So members of the Israeli government joined thousands of Israelis in a march in southern Israel on Tuesday, led by far-right activists, calling for the reestablishment of Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip and the expulsion of Palestinians. The march commemorated the 76th anniversary of the day Israel celebrates its Independence Day, known as the Nakba, or catastrophe, to the Palestinians, as more than 700 Palestinians were expelled from their homes to create the modern state of Israel in 1948. So joining the march were two ministers in Netanyahu's government. The communications minister, Shlomo Karhi, and he's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party, and National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. No surprise that he's there, and he is the leader of the Jewish Power Party. So Karhi said in a speech at the march, quote, "In order to preserve the security achievements that our soldiers lost their lives for, we must resettle Gaza with security forces and settlers that will embrace the land with love. This is the only real way to make the Hamas Nazis pay a price and to defend our nation and country," end quote. Ben-Gvir also spoke and said settlements and the expulsion of Palestinians are the true solution to the situation in Gaza. He said, quote, "We must return to Gaza now. We are coming home to the Holy Land. And second, we must encourage the voluntary emigration of residents of Gaza. It is moral," end quote. So Ben-Gvir, you heard him say that it's, they want to encourage voluntary migration. And we've seen other Israeli officials frame their desire for ethnic cleansing as voluntary migration. But of course, the Israeli onslaught in Gaza is making it uninhabitable, and it could give the Palestinians no choice but to leave if they have the option. I mean, right now, if Egypt was to say, come on in, I'm sure lots of them would leave, even though they would know that Israel would not let them return to their homes. So in October 2023, I just mentioned some other signs that this is what the Israelis want, the Israeli government wants, is to kick all the Palestinians out. There was that leaked document back in October 2023 that was prepared by the Israeli intelligence ministry that said the best post-war scenario for Israel would be the expulsion of all 2.3 million Palestinians living in Gaza. And since then, Israel has killed about 1.5% of the population of Gaza and has destroyed most of the Strip's infrastructure. And recently, Limor San Har Melech, she is a member of the Israeli Knesset and Ben-Gvir's Jewish Power Party. She said last month that there are secret plans in the works to build Jewish settlements in Gaza. So I think a lot of ministers, a lot of members of the Knesset, this is what they ultimately want. All right, so the next one here, Israeli bombing kills 40 in the Nuseirat refugee camp. This is in central Gaza. This article is from Middle East Eye. So this shows, over the past few days, we've seen a big escalation in Israeli airstrikes, artillery strikes, and things like that across Gaza. An Israeli air attack on the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza has reportedly killed at least 40 people, as increasing ground assaults from south to north were met with fierce Hamas resistance. Children were among those killed and wounded after Israeli fighter jets bombed a 3-story house belonging to the Karajah family in the Nuseirat camp on Monday night, according to the Wafa news agency. Al Jazeera reported that the building, which was completely flattened, was sheltering 100 displaced Palestinians. Among them were people newly displaced from Rafah in southern Gaza, where Israel has been threatening a major ground invasion. So some people that fled Rafah just got hit with a big airstrike in central Gaza. Dozens of those killed and wounded in the camp were trapped for several hours under the rubble of the destroyed building. Al Jazeera said that 40 people were killed in the attack on this building and a nearby school. It seems like Israel's kind of, they're going back to these heavy airstrikes that we saw, going back like October, November, December, January. This was just happening like every day. These really huge, in this case, they're probably using, if they flatten the building, some of these really heavy bombs that the U.S. is providing. And I guess Biden didn't say anything about not using them elsewhere in Gaza. It just goes to show they're going to do what they want. All right, so the next one here, Israel attacked aid workers despite knowing their locations. This is another one from Middle East Eye. So Israeli forces have carried out at least 8 attacks on aid convoys and premises in Gaza since October, despite aid groups providing their locations to Israeli authorities in advance, according to a new report. Human Rights Watch said in a report on Tuesday that the 8 Israeli attacks killed at least 15 people, including 2 children, and wounded at least 16 others. They included attacks on the World Central Kitchen, Doctors Without Borders, the UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, Medical Aid for Palestinians, and the International Rescue Committee, and the American Near East Refugee Aid Organization. So, and these are just incidents that they documented and were able to, find clear evidence for. And we know that there's been something like around 200 aid workers killed since October. And most recently was a UN worker who was actually an Indian. It was the first UNRWA or UN staffer, as far as I understand it. It was the first non-Palestinian UN staffer to be killed by Israel. And it was in southern Gaza. So, it just goes to show that these attacks on aid workers continue. And again, these are, think of the World Central Kitchen attack. They coordinated with the IDF where they were going. They were traveling in 3 separate cars, and boom, each car was hit with a missile, and until everybody was dead. All right, so the next one here, Blinken justifies Ukraine canceling elections. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken made an unannounced visit to Ukraine on Tuesday and delivered a speech where he justified Zelensky's decision to postpone elections. Presidential elections were due to be held in March, but they weren't, and Zelensky will remain in office after his term ends on May 20th. Ukrainian parliamentary elections were scheduled to be held last year in October, but they were also canceled. So Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials have justified the decision by pointing to Ukraine's constitution, which prohibits elections during martial law. And martial law was first declared when Russia invaded and has been extended since. However, at one point, Zelensky made clear that if he wanted to, he could hold a vote. He could hold elections. He said last year that he would hold elections if the U.S. and other Western countries paid for them and if Ukrainian legislatures agreed to amend the constitution. So he made it clear that it was a possibility, and I think that was in response to some European officials. And actually, believe it or not, out of all people, Lindsey Graham suggested it when he visited Kiev at one point last year. And Zelensky was saying, yeah, if you guys pay for it, sure, whatever. Was kind of the way he said it. So it goes to show, that this Constitution, which isn't very old, I don't know exactly when it was written, but, they could, if they wanted to hold elections, they could. But Zelensky later ruled out the idea, and there's been no pressure from the U.S. or other Western backers of Ukraine to hold a vote, despite the claims that we always hear that the proxy war is a fight for democracy. So in a speech in Kiev, Blinken visited Ukraine, made an unannounced visit. There's this video going around of him playing "Rockin' in the Free World" at a bar in Kiev. I mean, it's just unbelievable. As the Ukrainians in the Eastern Front, in the Northeast and Kharkiv are taking all these losses, and Blinken shows up and he plays a song. I mean, it's just the optics of it is just crazy. But anyway. And then in this speech, Blinken said that the U.S. and Europe had been helping Ukraine build democratic pillars, including free and fair elections. But he said a vote can only happen when the conditions are right. So Blinken said, quote, "That's why we're working with the government and civil society groups to shore up Ukraine's election infrastructure. That way, as soon as Ukrainians agree that conditions allow, all Ukrainians, including those displaced by Russia's aggression, can exercise their right to vote. People in Ukraine and around the world can have confidence that a voting process is free, fair, and secure," end quote, if it ever happens. So I just mentioned at the end of the story here that Zaluzhny, the former Ukrainian commander-in-chief, the general, he was removed by Zelensky earlier this year, and he was actually appointed ambassador to the UK. He's long been rumored as a potential presidential candidate in a future election, although he hasn't announced his intention to run. But earlier this year, there was polls in Ukraine that found Zelensky would lose to Zaluzhny in a presidential election. The poll found that 41% favored Zaluzhny in a first-round election, while only 23.7% would vote for Zelensky. So he definitely has some threats, if there was an election. And again, his term ends on May 20th of this year, so he's going to be the president of Ukraine indefinitely. All right, so the next one here, Estonia seriously discussing sending troops to Ukraine. This is just crazy. So Breaking Defense reported on Monday that NATO member Estonia is seriously discussing the possibility of sending troops to Western Ukraine to fill non-combat roles to free up Ukrainian soldiers so they can be sent to fight on the front. So this is the first that I've heard of this idea. And this deployment, of course, would mark a very big escalation of NATO involvement. I guess initially they're saying the Estonian troops wouldn't be sent for combat. They would be directly and publicly joining the war effort if they were taking over duties of Ukrainian soldiers so they could go fight. And I mean, that makes them targets for Russia, and that's direct war between NATO and Russia. It's completely insane. And this was said by Madis Roll, the Estonian president's national security advisor. He said that Estonia which has an active duty military of about 7,000 troops, by the way, a very, very small military. He said Estonia would prefer to make such a move as part of a full NATO mission, but he would not rule out the deployment as part of a smaller coalition. So he said, quote, "We should be looking at all the possibilities. We shouldn't have our minds restricted as to what we can do," end quote. So, he's kind of echoing Macron, who keeps saying, we shouldn't rule anything out. Even if, ground troops to Ukraine to fight Russia, we shouldn't rule that out. So after this report was published, there was some pushback from other members of the Estonian government, including the defense minister. But Roll, who made the comments, said that, this idea, he reaffirmed there was discussions ongoing about it. But he said, it wasn't a decision that was getting up to the prime minister to make a decision on a deployment. It's not even close to there yet, but they are discussing it. And I think this is kind of revealing because this might be what kind of Macron is talking about or what he's thinking about, because Ukraine, he was talking about sending ground troops to actually fight Russia on the ground at one point. But Ukraine is facing these manpower shortages, so maybe this is something that NATO countries are discussing is, relieving Ukrainian soldiers of other duties so they could go fight and die on the front. And Lithuania is another Baltic NATO state with a very small military, is also open to the idea of sending troops to Ukraine. Lithuania's prime minister told Financial Times last week that her country was prepared to deploy troops as part of a training mission. So that's a little different, but still, you have these very small countries that are NATO members and are very, ready to get into the fight. And, they wouldn't be so emboldened if they didn't have that war guarantee from the U.S. And now it's 32 countries in NATO. Goes to show the danger of the entangling alliances. Whenever we talk about this, I always have to mention that all this recent talk about NATO troops going to Ukraine highlighted the fact that there is already a small number of special operations soldiers. That was revealed by the Discord leaks last year. At the time, there was 97 NATO troops, including Americans, troops from the UK, Latvia, and France. All right. So the next one here, Biden signs a bill banning Russian uranium. So this is an article from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. President Biden signed a bill into law that bans Russian uranium imports and provides nearly $3 billion in handouts to boost domestic production. The bill provides an exemption to allow U.S. companies to import Russian uranium if they have no other options. So this became law after a while. Congress was pushing this for a while. And this is a big step because uranium was one of the last kind of big imports from Russia, as far as I understand it. And now they are cutting that off and subsidizing domestic uranium production. So the law requires the 90-day ban on Russian-enriched uranium imports unless the nuclear fuel is deemed essential. The U.S. government can grant waivers through 2028. So they have there's kind of some grace period, I guess, for getting off the Russian uranium. So this is all part of the economic campaign against Russia that has done nothing to stop the war. All right, so the next one here. The U.S. says that Georgia's foreign agents bill threatens relations. So this is a topic that I've been meaning to write something about for a while. The White House said on Tuesday that if a foreign agents bill passed by Georgia's parliament becomes law, the U.S. would have to fundamentally reassess its relations with the country. So this bill, which is titled On the Transparency of Foreign Influence, requires non-governmental organizations that receive at least 20% of their funding from abroad to register as foreign agents. Proponents of the bill in the ruling Georgian Dream Party have compared it to the U.S. Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, which requires individuals or entities engaging in lobbying or other activity on behalf of a foreign country to register as foreign agents with the U.S. Department of Justice. It's a law that's been on the books since like the 1930s, hasn't been used much until in recent years. And, they pick and choose when to enforce FARA. For one example I always think of is that AIPAC, the Israeli lobby group, does not have to register under this law somehow, even though they are clearly working on the behalf of a foreign nation. They claim, all of our funding is private. But anyway, so the U.S. and other Western nations have compared this bill to a similar law enacted by Russia in 2012 that was kind of expanded to kick out and ban a lot of NGOs that were basically funded by the West, funded by the U.S. government. I mean, there's a lot of NGOs funded directly by USAID, by the National Endowment for Democracy, and they were funding opposition parties in Russia as well. I put in some quotes from Victoria Nuland there, talking about the 2011 parliamentary elections. There was an election monitor in Russia that was funded directly by the U.S. government that made claims about election fraud. Those claims were picked up by Hillary Clinton, and it was one of kind of the turning points in U.S.-Russia relations. So anyway, of course, that's the comparison that the U.S. is making, ignoring any comparison with FARA, with the U.S. law, which is, a little different, but it's a very similar thing. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre condemned the Georgian bill as a Kremlin-style piece of legislation. And Georgia's president is expected to veto the bill, but the parliament could override it. Jean-Pierre said, quote, "It is unclear whether Parliament will try to override a potential veto. We have been outspoken about our concerns with that legislation, which runs counter to democratic values and would move Georgia further away from the values of the European Union. And let's not forget also NATO." End quote. And she also expressed support for the protesters who have held demonstrations against the legislation. And I know a lot of people, I don't know much about Georgia. I really do need to kind of look into this more. These protests are reminding a lot of people of, the Euromaidan in Ukraine in 2014 and other, types of color revolutions that have happened in this part of the world. She said, quote, "The Georgian people have been making their views known about this legislation, protesting in the streets, as you all have been reporting. We will see what Parliament does, but if this legislation passes, it will compel us to fundamentally reassess our relationship with Georgia," end quote. All right, so the next one here, where am I? There is so much on this page today. Hezbollah missile fires into northern Israel, kills a civilian and wounds 5 soldiers. This article is from Jason Ditz. So Hezbollah fired a round of anti-tank missiles at the kibbutz of Adamit in western Galilee on Tuesday, and the Israeli military said that it killed a civilian and wounded 5 soldiers in the area. There was also heavy Israeli airstrikes on southern Lebanon, which apparently came after this round of Hezbollah anti-tank missiles being fired at Israel. And there is reports of massive damage in southern Lebanon. Haven't seen any reports of casualties, but the escalation continues on this Israel-Lebanon border. All right, so the next one here, Biden announces significant hikes in China tariffs. So this article is from the South China Morning Post, and Biden announced on Tuesday that he's really ramping up the trade war against China. He's imposing new tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, advanced batteries, solar cells, steel, aluminum, and medical equipment. And he also criticized President Trump for failing to lift U.S. exports and boost manufacturing, basically criticizing Trump's trade war while increasing it. I mean, he's continued the work of Trump in this instance when it comes to the trade war. And there was this nice graph on the South China Morning Post. This is the story that we posted so people could get around the paywall, but I just want to go to the one on their site because it has a nice little chart of the tariffs, and it really goes to show. I mean, they put there's 100% tariffs now, or there will be when they are come into effect on Chinese electric vehicles. And as far as I understand, the U.S. doesn't import many Chinese electric vehicles because there's already pretty high tariffs on them. But still, it's a pretty major hike. So yeah, battery parts will increase to 25% tariffs. Electric vehicles, 100% tariffs. Face masks, 25%. I mean, lithium-ion electric vehicle batteries, 25%. Medical gloves, 25%. Natural graphite, 25%. Other critical minerals, 25%. A few other things. Semiconductors are going to be increased to 50%. That could really impact the price of electronics and computers and things like that. Solar cells increase to 50%. So syringes and needles will increase to 50%. So it just goes to show Biden continues this economic campaign against China. All right. So the next one here, the last story, Australian whistleblower sentenced to 5 years and 8 months. So this article is from Consortium News, and this is David McBride, Australian whistleblower who leaked classified material that revealed Australian war crimes in Afghanistan and, executions of civilians, really horrific stuff. And for revealing that, he is getting 5 years and 8 months in prison. And so that means he will go to jail until 2030. So a very harsh sentence for someone who revealed very blatant war crimes. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from David Stockman, Washington, D.C., the unaffordable and unnecessary war capital of the world. One from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies, the arsenal of genocide, the U.S. weapons that are destroying Gaza. One from Haaretz, the attack on a West Bank village by Jewish settlers was anything but spontaneous. One from Lucy Steigerwald, Jackson State and Forgotten History. It's a reprint from one of her stories from a few years ago about Jackson State. Everybody remembers Kent State. Jackson State was a police shooting at another university where a protester, I believe one protester was killed. Jackson State University in Mississippi, a junior at the college and a passing high school senior were killed by police who were responding to out-of-control protests. So 2 people were killed. Very young people, and nobody remembers that. I don't remember that personally. I wasn't alive then, but I didn't know about it until I read her article, which I think I read around the time it was originally published. But anyway, the spotlight is from Brian McGlinchey. George Washington warned against a passionate attachment to Israel. All right, so that was a lot of stuff that we had today. Our fundraiser's still going very strong. We should be able to wrap it up soon, but if you haven't pitched in and you have the means, please help us out, antiwar.com/donate. You could also support us just by sharing the show, like, subscribe, comment. Appreciate everyone that comments and engages and everything. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on X. I will be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.